HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Captain Gray's Gambit by J. H. Gelernter. Read by John Lee. Chapter 1. November the 22nd, 1803, at Tinne, on the north coast of the Sinai. To travel from England to India, one takes a ship round the southern tip of Africa and spends 4 months at sea, if the winds are with you, and 6 months if they are not. If you haven't 6 months to spare, or even 4, you can chance an overland crossing at the Isthmus of Suez, provided you can find ships to carry you to one end and away from the other, and that you're lucky and that you meet no Barbary slavers along Egypt's ill-defined eastern frontier. You might shorten the journey from Britain to the British Raj by half. A 2 months' trip was not unheard of. Under orders from His Majesty's Office of the Admiralty and Marine Affairs, it was the overland route that had taken Thomas Gray, with urgent dispatch, to India. He had been pressed into service as a royal postman, carrying letters from His Majesty's Secret Service in London to His Majesty's Major General Wesley, somewhere east of Bombay, at the head of an Anglo-Indian army. Gray caught up with Wesley at Asaya, and, after some minor confusion arising from the general having changed his name, unaccountably, from Arthur Wesley to Arthur Wellesley, the letters were delivered. Now Gray was on his way home, carrying a response and report by Wellesley to Whitehall. Gray travelled by the same overland isthmus route, reversed, and finally he was approaching the final leg of the trip. Having crossed from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, from the port of Suez through the Sinai Desert to the coast town of Tinne, Gray was seated comfortably on a beach, less than a mile east of the eastmost branch of the Nile Delta. The sand was warm and the surf gentle. Gray was eating flatbread dipped in date honey, and watching His Majesty's frigate Juno, 32, drop anchor 100 yards offshore. Gray finished his breakfast as Juno finished lowering her stern jolly-boat. It was early morning, just after dawn on the appointed day, at the appointed hour, of the first scheduled rendezvous attempt of HMS Juno and Mr. Gray. There would have been a second attempt in a week's time, and a third a week after that. But, much to his own satisfaction, Gray, being a man who enjoyed a race, he had beaten Juno to Tinne by almost 2 days. At Suez he'd purchased a pair of camels, the second to carry Gray's Bedouin guide, and crossed the isthmus in the wonderfully expeditious time of 3 nights and 2 days. 4 days were standard, but the weather was unseasonably cool, which meant the men were able to ride not only by night, but throughout the day, barring the hour before noon and the 2 hours after. Each day, as the sun approached its zenith, Gray and his guide spread a shade awning and slept a few hours, with the camels beside them. It was childish, perhaps, but sleeping camels never failed to amuse Gray, choosing, as they do, to repose with their serpentine necks and their spindly legs splayed out in arbitrary directions, as if they were rag dolls dropped from the top of a tall building. In any case, the short stops had helped Gray to Tinne with 2 days to spare. In thanks, he made a gift of the camels to the Bedouin, who, though unable to take credit for the cool weather, was a most amiable fellow, who'd kept Gray entertained throughout the journey with stories of French archaeological digs. One of his cousins had been with Napoleon's expedition as a translator. The Bedouin spoke no English, but his French, like Gray's, was perfect. The cousin had been present at Rosetta, when the great stone had been discovered. This was of particular interest to Gray. When he'd left London 4 months earlier, the stone had been the invariable topic of conversation at every club and coffee-house. The first translation of the stone's Greek portion had just been published. Gray wondered if, during his time away, anyone had deciphered the hieroglyphics. In the offices of the Secret Intelligence Service, at Admiralty House, beside the Horse Guards Parade, there was scarcely a man to be found without a homemade brass rubbing of the stone on his desk, and a Greek dictionary open beside it. Gray's good friend, Aaron Willis, Chief of Staff to the Chief of Naval Intelligence, Sir Edward Banks, had been forced to make a new career of confiscating the things and ordering Secret Service men back to their work. Willis had personally burned Gray's rubbing, which Gray had rubbed himself at the Montague House Museum with a cheroot. As it burned, Willis had dangled the flimsy sheet from his thumb and forefinger and bellowed the question at Grey, "Did the gentleman know there was an effing war on?" Grey smiled at the memory. In any case, he'd given the camels to the Bedouin guide, who reciprocated by inviting Grey to wait out his time till Juno arrived at the family camp, where his tribe was stopped for the season, on the banks of the Nile, a few miles to Tinez southwest. Grey had gratefully accepted and spent part of one day and all of one night enjoying some superb Bedouin hospitality. He smiled at that memory too. The jolly boat, an 18-foot cutter with 6 oarsmen pulling together against the tide, was just crossing the breakers. Grey stood, rolled up his trouser legs, and, with his boots stowed and his dunnage over his shoulder, waded out to meet it. "Are you Mr. Grey, sir?" said a young lieutenant at the boat's stern, while 2 of the oarsmen stood in the surf, holding the boat in place for Grey's approach. "I am, sir," said Grey, tossing his bag to one of the dry-footed oarsmen and pulling himself out of waist-deep water over the gunwales. "I'm Hopper, sir," said the lieutenant, and then to the oarsmen in the surf, "Shove off there!" "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Hopper," said Grey. The 2 men in the surf pushed the jolly boat back out over the breakers and were pulled aboard by their mates, and then, all together, they pulled for HMS Juno. The whole operation was splendidly efficient, and Grey had only just enough time to put on his jacket and make himself halfway presentable before oars were pulled up at the accommodation ladder. Grey climbed the accommodation with the ease of a man who'd spent many years at sea. The first volume of his working life had been as one of the red-coated Marines who round out the complement of all British warships. Having been recruited to naval intelligence from the Marine Officers' Corps, Grey retained a courtesy rank of captain, but it was a title he seldom used, discretion being the better part of spying. So, travelling as he normally did, as Mr. Grey, he eschewed saluting the quarterdeck and instead shook hands with Juno's captain, who greeted him at the gangway. "A pleasure to have you aboard, Mr. Grey. I hope we didn't keep you waiting." "On the contrary, Captain Crowther, your punctuality is impeccable. I appreciate your taking me off." "Certainly, Mr. Grey. Can I offer you tea?" "Thank you. Yes," said Grey. "Mr. Barnes," said Crowther to a young lieutenant on the quarterdeck, "when the jolly boat's hauled up, weigh and set a course north till we sink the land, then west by north. You have the deck." Captain Crowther led Grey into the great cabin, which occupied the entire width of the sternmost 15 feet of gun-deck, and was, on any warship, the only interior space that might be described as spacious, even if Juno's required Grey and Crowther both to stoop slightly. "Please to be seated," said Crowther, sitting himself on the stern lockers. "My table and chairs had to be struck below last night when it came on to blow. They should be up with the tea." So they were, and as Captain Crowther repopulated his desk with maps and papers, Grey sipped tea and regretted a final cup of coffee not drunk before parting from his Bedouin hosts. "So, I gather," started Crowther, as he was cut off by a knock on his cabin door. "Come," he said. "Beg pardon, sir," said a midshipman of about 12, "and Mr. Solomon reports all of the red grain is dry and only 1 of white damp, and Mr. Bibble reports down to 6 inches in the well." "Very good, Mr. Matthews. When she's cleared, have Mr. Barnes send the hands at the pumps to breakfast, and tell Walpole he may light the fires and serve hot." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Though you'll never go wrong erring on the side of good discipline and good manners," said Crowther to his young midshipman, "in these cases the 'yes, sir' will suffice alone." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The boy blushed, and the captain half smiled. "Now cut along. There's work to do." "Yes, sir." Crowther poured himself a second cup of tea and sat down opposite Grey. It's his first time at sea, and he's still tolerably nervous. He needs more beef. In any case, where was I? "You had gathered something," said Grey. "Ah, yes. I gather from my orders that you are carrying dispatches, but they, my orders, leave it an open question as to whether these are official dispatches. That is to say, I must know if I should order all hails be met with a signal of carrying dispatches." It was normal for 2 king's ships that encountered one another at sea to make their numbers and establish the seniority of their captains. It was not uncommon in those cases for the senior officer then to invite, that is to say, order, his junior to come across with any news he might have, to compare chronometers and to collect mail. The only circumstance in which a ship of the Royal Navy could ignore such an order, or any order a senior captain might make, was if she were carrying dispatches. Then a sloop might refuse the command of a three-decker beneath a pair of admirals. Naturally, it was a signal captains enjoyed having at hand. Grey thought for a moment, took a slow sip of tea. "Yes," he said, "I believe you would be justified." "Very good," said Crowther. "Mr. Winthrop!" he called, and the cabin door was opened by the Marine standing outside it. "Yes, sir." "Pass the word for Mr. Hopper." "Yes, sir," said the Marine, closing the door again. The letters that Grey carried from Wellesley pertained to the efforts of Napoleon's France to break the stalemate in its war with Britain. After subduing the rest of Europe, France had expected a swift victory over the United Kingdom. And why not? Having raised armies in response to the Jacobin terror, the Allies had swiftly lost Belgium, the Netherlands, Piedmont, Switzerland, and Italy. The first and second coalitions had each been smashed to pieces, and only Napoleon's decision to point the French army inward, replacing the Jacobins' dictatorship with one of his own, had kept guillotines out of Vienna and Berlin. Europe east of the Rhine had accepted a French empire west of the Rhine, provided it stay there. Only the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland refused to yield and kiss the ground before the young Bonaparte's feet. For the time being, the British Isles stood alone, the last great power that refused to believe the short Corsican intended to confine himself behind the River Rhine, and that wasn't prepared to accept a world under his rule. Fortunately, word of a French invasion fleet had reached England before the fleet itself, and now it faced a south coast heavily fortified, covered with Martello tower batteries that His Majesty's engineers seemed to put up in matters of hours, and behind which stood a new home army of 50,000 reservists. Still, the towers and soldiers could only hold if, as it had since 1066, the Royal Navy controlled the English Channel. Britain could only win on the beaches if she kept control of the seas. The Corsican himself had become quite open about this, proclaiming to his Armée of England, anxiously waiting to board their armada of landing craft, "Let us be masters of the Channel for 6 hours, and we are masters of the world." But the Royal Navy couldn't be moved, and now Napoleon was trying to move it by setting fires elsewhere in the world that Britain would have to spend time and treasure extinguishing. Wellesley and his Indian allies had General Pierre Cuvier-Péron and the Maratha Empire under control for the moment. Parliament was preserving a peace with the United States, even as Napoleon sold Louisiana to the Americans, and sold with it a considerable amount of North America that Britain claimed. Even so, it was only a matter of time. Either Britain would find allies who would enable its opening a second front, a land war on the continent, or one day soon a storm would blow the Channel squadron far enough off its blockade course for the French invasion fleet to slip out of port. Then the invasion would begin, and Britain would be forced to fight an ugly, costly defensive war on the beaches and the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets, in the hills, until the kingdom was either subjugated and starving, or the winner of a bloody, bloody Pyrrhic victory. It was only a matter of time, unless Britain could form a third coalition and make it Napoleon who was forced to fight a defensive war. "Sir," said Lieutenant Hopper, opening the door to the great cabin, "tell Mr. Barnes to answer any signal with the reply, 'Carrying dispatches,' and to keep to this course. As soon as we veer west, spread all plain sail and prepare to bend studding sails as well." "Very good, sir." "Capital," said Crowther to Grey once Hopper had withdrawn. "Capital. We ought to make splendid time back to the Rock, and to England then. Can I offer you some breakfast?" Chapter 2. The voyage west through the Mediterranean was fast and smooth. The Levanter that had shaken up Juno just before Grey's embarking her proved to be the last big blow she'd see east of Gibraltar. She touched just briefly at the Rock, to water and replace some lime juice of a suspect nature, and then was out into the Atlantic, rounding Cape Trafalgar and heading north against an indifferent current, making better than 10 knots with the westerlies blowing 1 point abaft the beam. England was perhaps a week away, and Grey's eagerness for hearth and home was tempered only slightly by the regret he always felt at the end of a sea voyage. Having spent so many of his formative years at sea, he found it easy to fall back into a naval routine, and less easy to step out of it. With the sailing smooth, the decks were free for the marines to drill, and Grey had indulged them, or it would perhaps be more accurate to say they had indulged him with joining in exercising the cutlasses, fencing and sparring on the forecastle, and in running out the Baker rifles. Afterwards Grey had retired to the quarter-deck, where he leant on the taffrail and read On the Flora of Lapland, and the Soil on Which It Grows, by a botanist of Grey's acquaintance named Kefauver. Grey had just finished a lengthy chapter on Cladonia rangiferina, the reindeer moss. In truth, said the book, a lichen, upon which the tundra ungulates principally sustain themselves. He was advancing to a discussion of the phosphoretic soils that sustain this lichen when a call came down from the foretop. "On deck there! Sail on the starboard beam!" All eyes turned east, towards the Bay of Biscay and France, though neither France nor, indeed, the horizon hiding it was visible. About 10 miles away and close over the water was a thick fog, topped by a rank of thunderheads. The weather in the bay was, as a matter of tradition, terrible, so this surprised no one. However, the sight of a sail headed due west out of the storm put the same idea in the mind of every man on the Juno. She must be a blockade runner, slipped out of Rochefort, doubtless a smuggler packed to the gunwales with wine and cognac, and wasn't it just her godless Jacobin luck to run out of a storm and into a British man-of-war? A second thought, though, entered the minds of the officers walking Juno's quarter-deck. They were, evidently, carrying dispatches. Did that give them leeway to snap up a smuggler? "Mr. Grey, a word, if you please," said Captain Crowther, who was standing at the leeward rail. As Grey stepped forward to join him, the other officers retreated to windward to give the illusion of privacy. "My standing orders," said Crowther to Grey, "require me to take or sink any blockade runner I encounter. However, my orders in this case are made subject to yours. If it is your belief that the letters you carry can't risk a sea fight or a day's delay, you must say so now." "Might I borrow your glass, Captain?" "Certainly." Grey brought the spyglass to his eye and took a close look at the French ship, which was perhaps 6 miles to leeward and not very much clearer in refraction than it had been to the naked eye. Still, Grey could make out 2 masts and square rigging. "A brig-rigged sloop, sir." "So I believe, Mr. Grey." "That would make her rather a lavish smuggler. Of course, there was the other possibility." "A sloop of war, sir?" "Possibly, Mr. Grey. Perhaps carrying dispatches of her own. The thought occurs, Mr. Grey." Grey looked a moment longer, then closed the glass and handed it back to the captain. "In that case, Captain Crowther," said Grey, "let us have her." Crowther smiled and couldn't resist the familiarity of patting Grey on the shoulder. He turned to his windward officers, all of whom had been straining to eavesdrop on the deliberations. "We shall beat to quarters, Mr. Barnes. Clear for action." Now Burns smiled. "Very good, sir." He turned to the boatswain at the break of the quarter-deck and bellowed, "We shall beat to quarters." The boatswain repeated the call, the marine at his side beat a drum-roll calling the ship to action, and every hand set quickly to his work. No doubt the same was true aboard the Frenchman, though their officers were facing a more difficult decision. Rochefort is a harbour with an uneasy approach, even in clear weather. As a lee shore in fog, it is mortal. That, taken with the British blockade to pass through for a second time, there could be no retreat for the sloop. The only question left to her was whether to run south or north. Grey felt sure that, at the moment, her officers were debating the Juno's sailing qualities, whether she would be relatively swifter with the wind afore or abaft the beam, whether north or south would offer the better chance of escape. But she seemed to be taking her sweet pastoral time about it. Still, she was on her original course, straight at HMS Juno. Could she be contemplating a fight? Certainly not, said Grey to himself. If she were a sloop of war, she might ship 10 or 12 or even 14 guns, none of them heavier than 4 pounds, for a total broadside of a mere 2 stone. Juno threw a weight of metal more than 8 times that. Including carronades on the quarterdeck and forecastle, her broadside was something in the way of 230 pounds. 230 to 28, and more than 10 score men against fewer than 90. No, for the Frenchman, a fight would be suicide. But still she came onward, at no great speed, perhaps 5 knots. But all the same she came onward. Soon she was close enough for some detail to appear in a spyglass. "Batavian colours, sir?" said Lieutenant Hopper, who was officer of the deck and had his own glass trained on the sloop. "Very good," said Crowther. Beyond the break of the quarterdeck, a landsman waster was lifting a chicken coop down the companionway. Grey heard him loudly observe, in case it hadn't occurred to his mates, "We ain't at war with the Dutch, though." "Shut your mouth, Nibley," answered a boatswain's mate. "Her colours don't signify. Get them damned birds below before I start you down myself." Indeed, her colours didn't signify. Any ship might legitimately fly a false flag in hopes of confusing an enemy, so long as she hoisted her true colours before firing a shot. It was commonplace. Soon the flag of Batavia would come down and the tricolore would go up. And so they did. "Batavian colours struck, sir. French colours running up." The Frenchman was still coming on. Grey squinted to get a clear look at it. "Sir," said Hopper a moment later, "I wasn't... That is to say, I am not quite certain, but I believe... At first I thought it was just the wind blowing it back on itself, but I believe, sir, that her ensign's inverted, red to the in and blue to the out." In 2 steps, Captain Crowther was beside him, saving time by appropriating the lieutenant's spyglass. "By your leave, Mr. Hopper," peering, squinting through the lenses. "You're right, Lieutenant." He returned the glass and turned to Grey, clasping his hands behind his back, looking just moderately disappointed. "Well, at least we shall still make a prize of her, but no fight today, Mr. Grey. She flies a distress signal." He turned to the helmsman. "Keep to this course. Straight at her." Reaching the distressed French sloop took not much more than half an hour. Crowther kept the Juno flying as fast as she could go, trimming and retrimming the sails to get every bit of speed out of the brisk westerly breeze. No seaman worth his salt would ever treat the case of a ship in distress as less urgent than the prospect of prize money. Grey reflected on the strange rules of honour at sea. It was a navy man's duty, and often his pleasure, to fight and often to kill any enemy he might encounter. However, that same enemy had only to ask for help, and he would be helped with the zeal of a sister nurse, who knew nothing of flags and wars, only that all men were brothers. As the Juno closed with the Frenchman, they could start to see the source of her distress. Her sails were all ahoo. Clewlines were snapped, and sheets were flapping. Her rigging was tangled and loose, and her decks, which from a distance had looked curiously bare, could be seen packed with bodies laid flat, and with a man, presumed to be the French surgeon, moving among them. When the ships were within hailing range, about 10 yards apart, parallel and each showing her starboard broadside, Crowther shouted across, "Ahoy, la sloop française! Qu'est-ce que le trouble avec vous?" On the French sloop, it was a warrant officer, the sailing master, Grey guessed, who answered, "Monsieur, we were terribly thrown about during the storm, the wind coming off the land making the very short sea and the cross sea. We could not get our head to the waves, monsieur, and were tossed, grievously tossed. The commander and the lieutenant are not able to stand, are not awake. The cadet is mortal, with broken hands and legs. We have not enough men to work the ship." "We will put across our surgeon and a prize crew," said Crowther. "We will make fast to you fore and aft. Throw your lines." The crew of the Juno was still at their battle stations. The guns were still run out, and the decks still cleared for action. Crowther now gave the order to secure from quarters and fasten the French sloop. Juno's wasters and forecastle men caught monkey fists thrown by some of the few French crewmen still standing, used them to haul across heavy French bowlines, which were fed, one at a time, into Juno's capstan. The wasters got to work turning the capstan, pulling the ships together as the lines tightened, finally making the bowlines fast to Juno's bitts, with the two ships only 10 feet apart. The French sloop, whose name had now been given, she was the Marianne, being a much smaller ship, reached her quarterdeck only slightly higher than the Juno's gun deck. A gangway was laid from her main deck to Juno's gun deck entry port. Lieutenant Hopper and a handful of Marines preceding them, the Juno surgeon and his mates and a skeleton crew began to cross over from the English ship to the French. Hopper was to take command. With the incapacity of the French officers, it was the sailing master, for so he was, the Frenchman in charge, who would present Hopper with the captain's sword, the ceremony that formalized the French surrender. The sailing master removed the sword from its sheath and held it out, laid across his two open palms for Hopper to accept. Hopper stuck the pistol he carried into his belt and reached out to take the sword. As he did, the French sailing master turned his right hand palm down onto the sword's hilt, gripped it, and drove it into Hopper's gut. As he did, hell broke loose. The wounded French who scattered the main deck rose from their extremis, miraculously healed. A dozen or so bore muskets and pistols, which they fired at the prize crew on the gangplank and the Marines at Marianne's gangway and Juno's officers on her quarterdeck. Some of the invalids ran to the Marianne's cannon, which were evidently primed and loaded. They were quickly aimed and fired directly into Juno's own gun ports, dismounting 7 of her 13 starboard guns and killing, in a stroke, perhaps 30 men of the gun crews. Aboard Juno, with the men having for the most part departed their battle quarters, there was chaos. Some men running back to their stations, others to the arms lockers, still others grabbing handspikes and belaying pins, and rushing to fend off the boarders who were now rushing up the gangplank and flooding into Juno's gun deck. The Marianne's gun crews raced to reload as the Juno's gun crews raced back to their guns or to guns that could still be fired. Juno's first shots, fired from the forecastle and the quarterdeck, and followed shortly thereafter by a single 12-pounder on the gun deck, crashed down into Marianne. The volley was returned by the surviving Marianne gun crews, who dismounted 3 more of the Juno's main cannon. These were the last shots Marianne fired. Juno poured 3 more volleys into her, making pig iron and matchsticks of her guns and forecastle before it became clear that but little crew remained aboard the Frenchman. The fighting was man-to-man and on Juno's gun deck, and it was bloody. Despite being grossly outnumbered, the French had the great advantage of surprise. The swords, pikes, and axes of the first Mariannes across the gangway hacked up a score of Junos before they'd recovered their wits, and a dozen more before they'd been able to arm themselves. The odds in Juno's favour had diminished from 2-1 to 3-2, and were still falling as the French pressed home a well-planned and utterly criminal ambush. For Gray's part, he'd been with the Juno's officers on her quarterdeck, watching Hopper accept the French surrender. As Hopper was killed, as the French barrage started, Gray reached for his sword, which he wasn't wearing, having been nominally a guest on Crowther's quarterdeck and not in uniform. He turned to the break of the deck, where a small arms chest sat before the helm. What he saw was Juno's Marine sergeant bleeding from a shot to the neck and unconscious. Gray grabbed the cutlass from the sergeant's limp hand and turned back to the rail. The French boarding crew, which had been primed for action, was already for the most part across. Gray grabbed the mizzen shrouds, pulled himself up onto the rail, and leapt 5 feet to his left and 10 feet down onto the cross-ship gangplank. He crashed down among the final dozen French boarders, knocking one off the plank and into the water as he landed, almost following the man in, grabbing a second Frenchman by the shirt front to steady himself, then hurling that man over the side into his friend's wake. Now Gray brought the cutlass to bear. The match of an experienced swordsman with a gang of overstimulated seamen was not a fair one. Gray stabbed easily into the belly of the first man he faced, who came on swinging wildly with a boat-hook. As he fell into the water, Gray ran the next man through. He, falling, pulled Gray's sword with him, forcing Gray to pull it back at an angle and strike the next man with his backhand, taking the head cleanly from the shoulders. The next Frenchman in line carried a long pike that he lanced forward at Gray. Gray leaned away from it, almost fell backward into the sea, grabbed the shaft of the lance, and yanked towards the Juno, steadying himself and pulling the French.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?